Perspective. It's probably one of the most important concepts that we never think about. Perspective, it's like the water that fish swim in. I mean, do you think fish know what water is? I mean, I think fish know what it's like to be out of water. But other than that, they don't necessarily know about the water. They just know that they're in this stuff that they float up and down in and that they move around in. But they don't ever think about the water. And I don't really know that, but there's always those jokes that, the younger fish doesn't even know what the water is whenever the older fish asks, how's the water? And they say, well, what is it? And that's what I think perspective is like for us. We all have a perspective, and doesn't mean that we think about it or even realize it. And today what we need to do is we have to stop and think about our perspective. Now, if you don't believe me that perspective matters, so let's take a look at a couple pictures I have up here. So this first one, it's an awesome picture because the guy on the island is like, oh, good, a boat. But the guy on the boat's like, oh, look, good land. So your perspective matters. Here's another one. These two guys looking at this number on the ground, and one says, well, obviously it's at 6. The other one says, no, it's a 9. Your perspective matters. And then this last one I really like. With that picture, it looks like, obviously the guy's holding the horse, but we know the horse is jumping. And it's even just the angle that the picture's taken that it makes it look like he's holding it. Because maybe the camera's a little bit low, because otherwise the horse isn't quite high enough to actually be above the man. I don't know, maybe the horse is. But perspective matters. So this week, we're thinking about perspective. Now, if you're here 2 weeks ago, I said we're going to be starting this new series for the beginning of the year called Salemology. And Salemology is all about who we are as a congregation. And so I talked about how we have this vision statement that I say most weeks, making followers, or we make followers, or however we want to put the beginning, but we make followers of Jesus who live the way of Jesus. And I said that we accomplish this by sharing the story of Jesus with our neighbors, calling our neighbors to give their lives to Jesus, and join the community of his people, and submitting with our neighbors to the way of Jesus to shape and pace our lives. And then the question becomes, well, how are we supposed to do that? Well, then I said it's with these core values. And this week we're talking about this first core value, loving God. And loving God is all about perspective. That is the most important piece of this conversation today, is perspective. Because as we saw with those pictures, depending on how we see the world and see God, we're going to respond differently to the world around us and to God. And loving God is about perspective. So if you want to take out your Bibles and turn to Mark chapter 12, we're going to be looking at a couple of verses here in 12, 29 through 30. So if you want to turn to these passages, here in a moment I will put them on the screen. But before I do, it's always important when we read the Bible to remember the context. So Mark 12, the context is this. Jesus has been having a discussion with Sadducees, which is a group of Jewish believers that had certain beliefs. Different than the Pharisees, different than other groups. And the Sadducees are discussing things with Jesus. And then this other teacher of the law, we're told, comes along and sees this discussion. And this teacher of the law, kind of like we would think about like a lawyer, somebody who's an expert in the Jewish way of living, he wants to get Jesus' opinion on the law too. So he says, Jesus, what is the most important commandment of all of the commandments? And so Jesus answers, and this is what he starts off with here in chapter 12 of Mark, verse 29. The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. So Jesus is going to answer, this is the most important commandment, and this is what he says. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. So Jesus' answer, if you know this passage, which we looked at a couple weeks ago, I just mentioned it, you know that there's a second commandment that Jesus offers. But the first commandment is this, to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Now, you might not realize that when Jesus quotes, or when he says this, he's actually quoting from the Old Testament, specifically from Deuteronomy chapter 6, 4 through 9. So what he's doing is he's saying that this passage, that passage from Deuteronomy, that's the most important commandment. Now, what we don't know about Deuteronomy that Jewish people did know was that this was one of the most important passages to them. It had a special name called the Shema, which is the first word in Hebrew, the word hear. So in Hebrew, the word hear is Shema. And so they called it the Shema. That's how the Jewish people, they named things usually from the first word of the passage. So every Jewish child learned the Shema, just like our kids might learn the Lord's Prayer or John 3:16. Jewish people said the Shema every day. In my Hebrew class in seminary, I actually had to learn the Shema in Hebrew because it was so important that my teacher, who was raised and was Jewish, he was a Christian, but he was raised Jewish, he made us learn it, and he actually taught us to sing it, and I won't do that. But maybe I'll do it for you later if you want to. I can sing the first 2 verses. I don't know all of them. And I can't recite all of them at all anymore, and I can't sing I could never sing all of them. But I can still sing the first couple. So Jesus is citing a very popular thing here. And so what he's saying is, and this is what we need to understand, the perspective that Jesus wants you to take on the world is related to the Shema. So if we look at this passage, we're going to understand the perspective that we're being invited into. And so that's why we actually need to go to Deuteronomy, because Jesus doesn't quote all of the Shema, but he means all of it when he quotes it. So Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. I'm going to read all of it, and then we're going to look at some of it. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the 4 door frames of your houses and on your gates. This is the Shema. Again, context is important. So the Shema is part of Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the first 5 books of the New Testament or the Old Testament. It's Moses giving a speech before he is going to pass leadership to Joshua, and before 2, Israel is getting ready to enter the Promised Land. And so Moses says, remember that God has made this covenant with you, this promise that he's going to bless you in this land if you remain faithful to him. And so Moses gives them this whole speech. And this is the beginning of that speech. And so Moses says, if you want to be faithful to the covenant, it all starts with the Shema. So verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The first thing we need to know about this passage, this word hear in Hebrew is called an imperative. Now we have imperatives in English. You probably learned about them in your English class at some point. But in English, we don't have what's called conjugations, where our verbs don't change based on, well, they do, they change the past tense. We know we added ed, sometimes the stem changes from eat to ate, but that's all we do. Well, other languages have way more changes depending on the verb. Now, the only reason I say this is because this is clearly a command. You can't hear this and think, oh, I'm hearing it. When you see hear in this case, and when you heard it, when you heard the word Shema, it was a command. It was you being told to do something. So it's basically not hear, but it's listen, Israel, is what Moses says. Listen and understand that the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So in the ancient world, there was not just one God. The Jewish people accepted that maybe that their neighbors believed in different gods. And for them, the question wasn't if those gods exist. The question was who was the God that they followed. And that's where we have this right here, the word the Lord. Now, this is another thing we need to know about Hebrew when it's translated to English in the Bible. When you see this word with this, it's called small caps in the Old Testament, that's actually translating the word Yahweh. Now, the word Yahweh is the name of God in the Old Testament. So really, it's Yahweh Elohim, or Eloheinu, because it's our God. So Elohim is the word God, Yahweh is the name. So what Moses is saying is, remember Israel, Yahweh is our God. So when you enter the land, that's who you are supposed to be faithful to, is Yahweh, because that's our God. Not Asherah, not Baal, not these other gods that the other people worship, Yahweh. And he says Yahweh is one. Now what this means, Echad, is that Yahweh rules supremely. There is only one God who rules the world, and it is Yahweh. So this is the first perspective that the Jewish people are supposed to enter the world with, or enter the promised land with. Remember that God is your God, Yahweh. And they wouldn't even say the word Yahweh. They said Adonai, which is why in Greek we put it as the Lord. Because the Lord means, Adonai means the Lord. So they would say Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. They would not say Yahweh. But Yahweh is our God, and he rules alone. That's what Moses was telling the Jewish people. So now we come to Jesus. This is what Jesus is saying the most important commandment to remember is that, one, God is the creator and ruler of the world. And two, you better know your response to that fact. And if you respond the way you're supposed to, you will remember that God is deserving our worship and our allegiance. And so the first commandment that Jesus said is to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And what he's saying is to remember that God alone is worthy of worship. And remember that Jesus claims to actually be God in the flesh and the chosen king that comes to rule the world. So this is the perspective that we're supposed to take. But Moses doesn't stop there because he wants to help people understand, because if you're supposed to put God, if you're supposed to have a certain relationship with him and remember that he made you, well, then this is how you do that. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your strength. Different than what Jesus said, I realize. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now this passage, love. Now again, we can't see this in English. This is a command. Just like that word here, love is a command. It's something that we're supposed to do. It's something that we're supposed to be. It's something that we're supposed to live out. We think about love as a feeling, and that's how our culture talks about it. But I know that when we actually think about love, that we think about it as something you do as well. Because I know all of you, if I'd ask you, would you rather somebody tell you that they love you, or would you rather them show you that they love you? You would say, I'd rather them show it than just say it. Now, ideally, we want them to do both. We want them to say it and to show it. But if somebody just tells you they love you, but you can't tell it by how they live, well, it doesn't seem like they love you at all. And so when it comes to responding to who God is, Moses says you respond to who God is as your God and your creator and the one who deserves your worship. You do that through love. And you love God with all of your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. So these words in Hebrew, heart is actually more like mind. It's about everything inside of your head, your emotions and your will and your desires. Love God with everything inside. Now, soul is about, and this is what they told us in seminary, you pick up any book, soul is about the worst translation for that word that exists. And the only reason it's there is because it was how originally it got translated in the King James, and now nobody wants to change it. Maybe someday they will. The word actually means throat. And what it actually refers to is your physical life. Because all of your life, you think about throat, it's a metaphor for your life. Because if your throat, something happens to your throat, your physical life will no longer exist. And so, love God with your inner life, with your outer life, or your physical body. And then this last word, strength, actually the Hebrew is so obscure in English that we can't even really say it. But the whole idea is basically, if there's anything left that you can come up with that isn't in your inner life or your outer life, well, God wants that too. He wants you to love him with everything. That's what it's about. So the Shema as Jesus puts it, is slightly different because we got to remember that Jesus, they didn't all walk around with the Bible. They learned things through tradition. Just like we learn like something like the Lord's Prayer, but if you look at actually an English translation of the Lord's Prayer, it's slightly different than the way we learned it. And we actually added something at the ending. And we know that, we're not hiding it, but it's part of our lived experience. For the Jewish people, the shema that Jesus knew had this mind and strength. Heart, soul, mind, and strength. Making it actually just more clear exactly how you're supposed to love God. But that's what Jesus says they're supposed to do. This is what he's telling us. The greatest commandment is about loving God. And loving God is about what we do. And it all starts with perspective. If our perspective is that God made the world, then we ought to live according to that reality. And that's what we need to understand. If we believe that God made the world, well, then Jesus is saying, well, then there's a proper response to that, and it's to love God. And so that's why we're invited to love God. And so this is what it comes down to. We love God by offering him our whole lives. So as Salem Magley Church, we say we're loving God. We love God by offering him our whole lives. And this becomes more clear when we finish, or we go to the next verse in Deuteronomy 6. These commands that I give you today are to be on your hearts. It's about perspective. And if our perspective is that God made us, and he made us and he knows the way to find true life and flourishing, which is the other piece that we will talk about when we talk about living the way. Because living the way comes back to this as well. And actually, whenever I first wrote this sermon, I realized last week, and then we canceled, so I didn't have to do this. I realized that I had written the sermon for living the way and not for loving God. And so I had to rewrite it, which is okay because I have a lot of stuff I can use in a couple weeks. But living the way is about, once we understand that the position we have with God is that we're supposed to give him our whole lives, well, then we live a different kind of life because of that. But it starts with loving God. Now, Paul had a different spin on this because Paul also knew that we love God by offering him our whole lives. He was a good Jew. And so he has a different spin on it. Romans 12, 1 through 2. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Paul believed so deeply that we should respond to God in a certain way that he said our response should be offering ourselves as a living sacrifice. We sacrifice ourselves to God in his way. We let his will become our will. We let his perspective become our perspective. We love God by offering him our whole lives. Do you believe there is a God? Do you believe that this God revealed himself first through Scripture and then ultimately through Jesus Christ? If you do, then make sure you live by that perspective. I can't say that more. If we actually believe who Jesus says he is, then we should live according to his perspective. This is why loving God is our first priority. Now, there's a different word we use for this, and Paul used it. He said, when you offer yourself as a sacrifice, he says, this is worship. We think about worship as what we're doing right now, or maybe in certain traditions, we think about worship exclusively the singing part, but all of our life is supposed to be worship. It starts with what we do today because this frames the way we think about the world, and we'll talk about that during Living the Way. But it doesn't end here. It only begins here because we live a life of sacrifice to God, and that is worship. So if we actually believe these things, we should make it central to our lives. And that's why we love God by offering him our whole lives. So everything turns on this idea of loving God. That's where it all turns. It's about about the perspective that we take. If we believe all of this stuff is true, then we should take it seriously. And it should be the perspective that we live by. And that's exactly what Jesus invited us into. That's what Paul believed, and that's what all of the authors of the Bible did. They centered their lives around God and his way. And we do that by offering him our whole lives. And we love God by offering him our whole lives. So a couple of things about this. First, I understand that this is a tall order. And it's not the one that I want to give. It's the one that Jesus gives. He says the most important commandment is to love God. And love God is about putting ourselves in the proper perspective to respond to God as our creator. And to say, I understand, God, that you made me so you know how I should live. You know what I should value. And so I'm going to trust you and write your ways on my heart. And also, I understand that it's challenging in the sense that there's still a lot left unsaid, which is why there's all of the rest of the weeks where we actually talk more about loving God, because it turns out all of these ideas, all of these other core values flow straight out of loving God. And let me show you how. Because we love God, we're supposed to take his perspective. His perspective has an opinion about how we should treat other people, loving others. And if we believe his perspective will change the world, well, obviously we're going to make followers because we're going to want to share it. But it's just not how we treat other people. It's also about the life we live. If we believe that God has a perspective on how we should live, well, we're going to live according to it, which is living the way. And living the way comes to a certain kind of relationship with God and with others, seeking harmony. But we'll talk about these ideas over the next 4 weeks. For now, we need to get one thing straight. What is our perspective? Do you believe that God made you? Do you believe he made everything? Do you believe that Jesus is inviting you to follow him? Do you believe that he died to set you free from sin so you could follow him as your king and become a member of his kingdom and become part of his colonized people on earth, or just a church? Do you believe that that's the world and what you're invited to be a part of? If you do, then let's live according to those beliefs. And it starts with how we respond to God. And the response that we're supposed to give God is love. And we love God by offering him our whole lives.